Bruce Feldman, again, senior writer at theathletic.com. What is life like as an air raid defensive coordinator, not the one facing the air raid, but a part of a team that runs it, and your job is to be a defensive coordinator? Bruce, great to have you on. We appreciate your time. Fantastic article. Craig Smoak, Paul Catalina, and David Smoak. So is this right now, Alex Grinch and USC, is that like focus number one because of what USC's trying to do with Lincoln Riley?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, obviously people have known about the air raid for a couple of decades. And it's been obviously the offense and the quarterbacks that has gotten so much attention. But now, given Lincoln Riley took over a USC program that had won 4 games, and then last year they jump all the way to 11-3, produced another Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, with so much attention on whether he can win a national title really is tied to, can their defense get a lot better? And Alex Grinch had been with him at OU, and he did get them better on defense, but now this defense is atrocious, and it was, before they got there. And that's the challenge, is what does it take to fix it, and how hard is it to have a really salty defense when your offense and everything is the focus around the program seems to be around the offense.
Bruce, obviously this might be an obvious answer, but when you talk to coordinators, was the answer having more guys who are first team depth-wise capable, as opposed to maybe what happens a lot of times is some of the guys who would be defensive backs wind up being wide receivers because they run 8 deep at wide receivers and these things, and they're shorter defensive backs than they normally would be?
I think it's, that's a personnel thing, and there's definitely part of that. I think, depending on how, who you talk to, they all have some different challenges and maybe some different theories. But one of the big challenges, across the board is most of these offenses do not have tight ends. And so when they play physical teams that maybe are in 12 and 13 personnel with 2 tight ends or 3 tight ends, they can't practice it because they just don't have those kind of bodies. Even if they have, defensive ends, or they try to move over on scout team to be tight ends. And, some of the coaches I talked to said, usually those guys don't want to be out there as a tight end. So you kind of get a not great look from them. And then there's the other element of, and this isn't unique to this, certainly Baylor fans will definitely recognize that this isn't unique to just air raid offensive, but teams that run a lot of up tempo, it can be really hard to practice, to get good reps in for the defense, because it's just, as the guys who were with Cliff Kingsbury and Dana Holgerson in Houston will call, it was like you couldn't even get lined up. You didn't even know what just happened. So it's a lot of stuff. It's also how the opponent who's going to play an air raid calls a game. It's almost like you're expecting the shootout, so you're always on your heels. And one of those big issues that Grinch and USC had last year was they were imploding in the fourth quarter of games down the stretch. And I think some of it is just how many reps that those guys are out on the field for.
Bruce, I remember when Phil Bennett used to talk about one stat that would bother him to no end when it would get brought up after, a Baylor game. That would be the total yardage. He's like, the total yards don't matter. It's more about the stops and it's the turnovers and it's, whether they scored or not and those types of things. Could you sense any kind of like trade-offs that coaches are making now in terms of maybe things that seemed important prior to this kind of era that are no longer maybe as important in the grand scheme of things as far as defending this?
Yeah, I think a lot, as he said, and I know my colleague Max Olson at The Athletic has done some really interesting work on stop rate and a metric that's maybe more telling, than what we thought of, 15 years ago as the way. I think for some of these coaches, especially Grinch, it's like you're constantly playing, talking about how you message this to get guys, because when he got to OU, they were terrible on defense, and he said so much of it is like, oh God, here we go again. As soon as they give up a big third down conversion, and I think one thing that maybe we in the media sometimes lose sight of is, when you go up against a great quarterback or a great offense that operates so well at practice every day, what that can do to a defense's psyche, like the psychological aspect that's maybe lost in this. You think about what Lincoln Riley's had. I mean, he had Baker Mayfield, Heisman Trophy winner. He had Kyler Murray, Heisman Trophy winner. He had Jalen Hurts, just took a team to a Super Bowl, and now he has Caleb Williams. That is a lot of stuff for an opponent to deal with, especially when it's your team. And going back to the days at Texas Tech, a couple of those coaches I talked to on the defensive side, when we first got there, we had Davis Webb, who obviously became an NFL quarterback. We had Patrick Mahomes, who became an NFL MVP. The first practice, we gave up like 20 touchdowns, and guys are like dunking the ball over the goalpost at every turn. It's like, what's going on here? And I think that part of it is why you have to maybe reevaluate what it takes to play winning football when the identity of the program is so much rooted into the offense. And I think, an offshoot of that, you guys, I feel like this is something worth bringing up, is it's a lot easier to recruit to the offense when you have such a reputation for prolific offense. It's the easiest thing in the world probably for Lincoln Riley to have quarterbacks and receivers. The defensive side of the ball is the flip side now. It's a lot harder, I think, to get those kind of players because that's not where the shine is on the program.
Bruce, there's part of your article about the physicality of practice, because the thoughts were because of defense, if they're a part of a defense that runs the air raid or whatever, it's hard to practice physically. Was it Bob Stoops that changed that mindset a little bit?
He did, because, he went in, he had worked for Steve Spurrier, another, prolific offensive mind, when he was a defensive coordinator at Florida, and they won a national title. Then he gets to OU, and lo and behold, he hires Mike Leach in that air raid. But he was very mindful of how it was going to work, because he knew, all right, I love what he's doing here, but it can't come at the expense of the other things I need to see from my defense. So I think for people who haven't read the story yet, I think if you get to the point of how Bob Stoops was able to make it work, but as Bob pointed out, he was like, hey, I had an advantage on all these other guys because Mike worked for me. I was the boss. I was the head coach. And I think so he can say, hey, this is how much we're going to do. And he knew what was important on both sides of the ball. And I think that's the challenge of the balance, especially when the head coach is the air raid guy, and then this is how you're working to try to make it best work. But a lot of these guys also evolve. I mean, Dana Holgerson certainly has evolved. Lincoln has evolved. Garrett Riley, who certainly did a terrific job at TCU, now is at Clemson. He picked up elements of the run game from App State. I think there's just those kinds of things. We've seen Sonny Dykes absolutely evolve, and I think it's an interesting it's kind of an interesting subplot to the air raid as it is.
Bruce Feldman, theathletic.com, Fox Sports with us on 365 Sports.
So do head coaches that, like Lincoln Riley, have to maybe dial it back a couple of degrees on their offense to help their defense out, even though that might be counterintuitive to what they're running through in their head?
That absolutely seems like the sense I get. What does it take for a program to be at its best? And I think he's done that, but I think there's, again, it's tied into personnel, it's tied into mentality, it's tied into mindset. And I think if you ask him, he's done everything but win a national title. And I think what does it take to do that? We're going to find out, because I do think they've recruited better through the transfer portal this year than they did last year when they got some guys. But they were, they got a guy from Wyoming who really wasn't a star at Wyoming. Now he's starting at USC. That didn't, it doesn't sound like the way it would be. Or a guy who couldn't get on the field at Alabama. Now he's starting at USC. And I think now you're seeing guys who are, much more coveted, talented players on the defensive side of the ball going in there and hoping that, they don't need to be the 85 Bears, I think, to make a national title run. But they got to get a lot better, and they got to especially get a lot better in the fourth quarter.
Well, I brought this up earlier, Bruce, and I think, Paul, you're the one that answered it, but you do see at least now more teams that run that type of offense having a chance to truly win a national title. Isn't that happen more often than not, that it used to be the exception?
Yeah, I think so, because I think, look, a lot of college, a lot of quarterbacks came up in some version of that offense. So I think people have seen, look, you can make a program relevant. You can make it into a winner. You may not really win it, may not necessarily win a national title with it, but I think it's like, okay, how can we build off this? And I think that's much different than it was, 20 years ago when it was in Lubbock and it was kind of first getting people's attention.
I remember this comment, and I sent this in a text to you. I think it may have been even yesterday evening, but in 2013, again, it wasn't the air raid, but it's part of the same guts of your story. Baylor beat West Virginia 73-42, and their defensive coordinator, and I don't know if it was Tony Gibson or not, called the game catastrophic. Is that something that you kind of heard, at least maybe not that word, but some words from those who have had to run it while they have themselves an air raid offense?
I think that might have been Joe DeForest, who might have been the defensive coordinator before. Like Tony Gibson got there, and I think he got Dana when Dana had evolved. It wasn't like Dana was against, live tackling in practice, but I think of how they practiced around that was evolving. And I think they saw it. It was like, hey, we can blow up the scoreboard and we can put up points and we can, have, gaudy stats. But if that's only going to get us 6-6, we gotta fix that. And so I think that's just been a big part of the evolution from almost all these guys. And very few, Mike Leach was one of the few traditional air raid guys where he's throwing it all over the place. Graham Harrell is a protege of his. Obviously, you guys remember was a terrific quarterback there. And he's really the only one now who I feel like is still kind of a traditional core air raid guy. We've seen, Phil Longo, even though he didn't coach at Texas Tech, would always make these pilgrimages down there. And now he's risen up as an offensive coordinator. And he was working for Matt Brown in North Carolina, and they obviously had Drake May, a terrific quarterback. They threw it all over the place. But even the last few years in North Carolina, they ran the ball really well. And I think so you see different wrinkles. You see different, OU under Riley and Bill Bedenbaugh, they had their GT counter game, and they were really effective in the run game. So I think you definitely see people trying to make it blend in a lot better.
I have a question for you. How many stories do you, or like a to-do list of features? Because you write a lot of incredible features, and they're also very in-depth like this one. This isn't just like 200 words. How many of them do you already have jotted down that you're working on? Do you always keep yourself 4 to 6 to 8 weeks ahead of schedule? And then, of course, if something big breaks, you're going to be a part of that too?
Yeah, I try to. I mean, look, it's not like I have to cover college basketball or not like I have to cover a few other sports. So you try to keep your list of stories you think people are going to want to sit down and dig into. And this was one where I probably could have talked to another dozen coaches because, Mike Leach himself had 8 or 9 defensive coordinators in his time as a head coach. And there's so many other guys who I thought, and I didn't just talk to defensive coordinators, I talked to some offensive guys and some defensive assistants as well for this. But, I think that's the fun part of the job where you can have an idea and then go through your Rolodex and say, who do I want to talk to about this? What do I think would be good? And, that's one of the real fun parts of the job.
What are your thoughts, Bruce? And I know you have to go. By the way, Bruce has been juggling kids camps. Your kids are at camps, and I know that can be a buzzsaw. What are your thoughts where we are in college football with so many things changing? Is it the craziest time you've ever seen?
I think some of it is when it comes to the combination of the portal and NIL. Now, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I think there's a lot of really great things that are going on in college sports. I mean, we're seeing, like a real elevation of athletes who aren't just football and men's basketball and football players. I think you're seeing other sports. People are, really finding, the College World Series and other sports that I think a lot of stars have been marketed and made. And so people want to watch it. And I think that's been a really cool aspect of this. But I think just in terms of the actual game of college football, I think what's you hear a lot of from coaches is, man, the life in the NFL is a lot more attractive because you have a life away from it. Whereas this, I think there's just a lot of challenges that people are juggling time-wise because it's all year round. Now recruiting has become what it is. The portal has become what it is. Roster management is so hard. No one's going to feel for the coaches because they're making more money than they ever have. But I do think, the games itself, I still think, we all love that about the sport. And I think there's still a lot to love about what we have in college.
My last question for you. The really one untied question right now in college athletics, or at least is what's happening with the Pac-12. You know the story, how that affects really other things as well, and whether they can get to a certain number, a certain amount of years, grant of rights, who's this and who's that. What are your thoughts about, in your opinion, what might happen?
Well, I think the biggest question in the short term is, okay, what happens if Colorado and potentially Arizona end up deciding they want to go to the Big 12? Does that prompt bigger brand schools, quite honestly, with Oregon and Washington, and from a football standpoint, or even Utah? And those are some of the best schools right now. They're the best schools left in the Pac-12. What do? I think if they stay firm and maybe they add San Diego State, which I suspect could happen, then I think they're in a probably much more position of strength if you're in the Pac-12. Now, I mean, it's not quite what it was, certainly not what it was when they had USC and UCLA. But remember, Colorado football has been largely irrelevant for the last 20 years. Now Deion Sanders got there, and now there's a buzz. But who knows how long Deion's going to be there? So I think that's the part where it's like, okay, where are they going to be on the TV dial? How is this going to play? There's a lot of uncertainty because there's just been a lot of instability. Whereas I think the Big 12, they also had a new commissioner, and I think he has hit the ground running in a more significant way than George Kliavkoff, the new Pac-12 commissioner, I feel like he's been bailing water ever since he replaced Larry Scott.
Did your book swing your sword after Mike Leach's tragic passing? Did you get a surge of people buying that book? I'm just curious. Did that happen?
I think there was a lot of people who had curiosity about Mike. If they didn't know his story, I think then all of a sudden it was like, wait, who is this guy? Like, what? Because he's a fascinating character, and I think there was quite an uptick in that because there'll never be another one like him. So nope. I think because of that, I think it brought a lot more eyeballs to it, and I feel very grateful that Mike was generous with his time, and I was able to get to know him like I did, and it's so like I felt like he lived like 5 lifetimes in one. It's just sad that we don't have him anymore because he's somebody who was like always there. You could text him or call him at any hour, and you could pick up where you left off with it.
Bruce, thank you very much. Great stuff today on the Air Raid, the story this week in theathletic.com. Bruce Feldman, college football reporter, Fox Sports, theathletic.com.